The heat inside Chateau Marchand was suffocating, a thick wall of grilled meat, burnt butter, aged whiskey, and the kind of cologne that announced wealth before words ever could. It pressed against Regina John's skin, mixing with the cheap body spray she'd hurriedly applied in the staff bathroom 12 hours ago, back when her shift was supposed to end at 6. It was now approaching 10, and the soles of her feet felt like they'd been scraped raw against hot pavement. Every step sent a sharp current up through her calves, her lower back screaming in protest as she balanced another tray of crystal glasses filled with drinks she could never afford to taste. Regina had been serving tables for 4 years, long enough to perfect the art of disappearing. She moved through the dining room like smoke, present when summoned, invisible the moment she wasn't needed. Her smile was a mask she'd learned to paint on before clocking in, wide enough to earn tips, neutral enough to avoid unwanted attention. Her hands never trembled when she poured wine for men who spoke in coded phrases. Her eyes never lingered when envelopes passed between suited figures in shadowed booths. She had trained herself to see everything and remember nothing, because in a restaurant like this, curiosity didn't just kill the cat, it buried it in an unmarked grave. Tonight, though, something was different. Table 12. The corner booth framed by dark mahogany panels and low amber lighting, positioned just far enough from the main floor to ensure privacy. Edward Williams sat there, shoulders squared, his tailored charcoal suit sharp enough to cut glass. He was a man who didn't raise his voice because he never had to. His presence alone commanded silence. Regina had served him 3 times before, always the same routine. Scotch, neat. Rare filet. No dessert. 25% tip left in crisp hundreds. Never a word of complaint. Never a flicker of emotion. But tonight, she noticed Peter. Edward's bodyguard sat 1 table over, positioned with a clear sight line to both the entrance and the kitchen. Peter was a wall of a man, broad-shouldered and silent, the kind who could blend into the background despite his size. Normally, he sat motionless for hours, hands folded, eyes scanning the room in steady intervals like a lighthouse beam. But tonight, his right knee bounced beneath the table. His jaw clenched and released. And every 40 seconds, his hand drifted inside his jacket, fingers brushing against something hidden there, only to pull away empty. Regina's instincts flared. She'd learned to read body language the way some people read books. It was survival. And Peter's body was screaming. She refilled water glasses at the adjacent table, her movements slow and deliberate, buying herself time to observe. Peter checked his watch. Glanced toward the service corridor. Checked his watch again. His breathing was shallow, his gaze darting to the emergency exit near the kitchen with an urgency that didn't belong to a man simply doing his job. Regina's pulse quickened. She knew better than to get involved. She knew the rules of this world. Keep your head down, collect your tips, go home. Men like Edward Williams existed in a stratosphere she could never touch, surrounded by dangers she couldn't afford to understand. But as she watched Peter's hand tremble slightly while reaching for his water glass, a cold certainty settled in her chest. Something was about to happen. Something bad. And the man sitting calmly at table 12, cutting his steak with surgical precision, had no idea that the person paid to protect him was the one he should fear most. Regina John stood frozen for half a second, tray balanced on one hand, her practiced smile still fixed in place. But inside, every alarm in her body was ringing. She had a choice to make. And whatever she decided in the next few minutes would change everything. Edward Williams first walked into Chateau Marchand on a Tuesday in late September, and the entire dining room seemed to inhale and forget to breathe out. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The hostess led him to table 12 without consulting the reservation list, her hand smoothing her skirt twice before she dared speak. He ordered without opening the menu, his voice low and steady, each word falling like a gavel. Scotch, neat. Rare filet. That was all. Peter followed 3 steps behind, a shadow in human form. He took his position at the adjacent table, angling his chair so his back never faced the entrance. His hands rested flat on the tablecloth, motionless as marble. He ordered nothing. drank nothing. For 2 hours, he sat without shifting, his eyes moving in calculated sweeps across the room, cataloging faces, exits, movements. When Edward finished his meal and stood, Peter rose in perfect synchronization, and they left through the front entrance as silently as they'd arrived. The following Tuesday, they returned. Same time. Same table. Same order. Same eerie precision. By the 4th week, Regina understood she was witnessing a ritual. Edward Williams was a creature of absolute routine, and his routine was designed to be predictable only to those who served him. Everyone else in the restaurant saw a well-dressed man enjoying a quiet meal. Regina saw something else entirely. A man testing his environment, measuring it, ensuring that every variable remained controlled. And Peter was the mechanism that enforced that control, unblinking, unyielding, a human tripwire. Regina had learned to move around them with the caution of someone navigating a minefield. She poured Edward scotch with hands that never trembled, delivered his steak precisely 7 minutes after he finished his drink, and cleared his plate the moment his knife and fork crossed at 4 o'clock. She never asked how his meal was. She never made small talk. And she never, ever looked Peter in the eye. Because Regina John couldn't afford mistakes. Not here. Not anywhere. She was 26 years old and exhausted in ways that went deeper than sore feet and aching shoulders. Every paycheck was a calculated equation: rent, utilities, groceries, and the monthly wire transfer to her mother in Newark. Her younger brother was starting his 2nd year at community college, the first person in their family to make it that far, and Regina had promised to help carry the weight. That promise meant double shifts, forced smiles, and swallowing every indignity the restaurant industry offered. Her manager, a wiry man named Dominic with breath that always smelled faintly of cigarettes, had made it clear during her first week. "You see things here, Regina. Rich people doing rich people things. Your job is to serve, not to remember. You understand?" She'd nodded, and she'd meant it. She had no interest in the lives of men like Edward Williams. She didn't care what business he conducted, what empires he controlled, or what sins funded his weekly fillet. All she cared about was the crisp bills he left folded beneath his empty glass. Always 25%, always exact. For 8 weeks, that arrangement worked perfectly. Edward Williams came and went like clockwork. Peter sat frozen in his silent vigil. And Regina collected her tips, kept her mouth shut, and survived. But routines, no matter how rigid, were only as reliable as the people maintaining them. And tonight, for the first time since September, Peter's hands were no longer still. Regina first noticed it when she approached table 12 to refill Edward's water glass. Peter's right hand was inside his jacket, fingers pressed against something hidden there, and when she moved into his peripheral vision, his hand jerked out as if she'd caught him stealing. His palm was empty. But the movement was wrong, too quick, too guilty. She poured the water with her practiced efficiency and stepped away, telling herself it was nothing. Maybe he was adjusting his shoulder holster. Maybe the restaurant was warmer than usual. Maybe she was imagining things because she was tired and her mind was looking for problems that didn't exist. But she couldn't stop watching. Edward ate with his usual methodical precision, cutting his steak into uniform pieces, chewing slowly, his expression unreadable. He seemed completely unaware of anything unusual. Yet 3 feet away, Peter was unraveling. His knee bounced beneath the table in a rhythm that had no pattern, starting and stopping like a car engine misfiring. His jaw clenched so tightly Regina could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. And every 30 seconds, his eyes flicked toward the service corridor that led to the kitchen and the back alley beyond. Regina delivered dessert menus to table 9, but her attention never left Peter. His breathing had changed. It was shallow now, rapid, the kind of breathing that came before something broke. She watched him check his watch, then glance at the service door, then check his watch again. The repetition was compulsive, mechanical, like a man counting down to an event he both dreaded and anticipated. She tried to dismiss it. Peter was a bodyguard. Maybe he'd received a threat assessment. Maybe there was a security concern she couldn't see. Maybe this was just what vigilance looked like when the stakes were high. But Regina had watched this man sit motionless for 8 weeks straight, and she knew the difference between alert and anxious. This wasn't vigilance. This was fear. Or worse, anticipation. Her hands began to tremble as she cleared plates from table 7. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep moving through her section as if nothing had changed. But her instincts, the same instincts that had kept her safe in a world where powerful men played dangerous games, were screaming at her now. Something was wrong. Not just unusual. Wrong in a way that made her stomach twist and her pulse hammer in her throat. She passed table 12 again, this time carrying a tray of wine glasses to the bar. Peter's hand slipped inside his jacket once more, and this time she saw his fingers close around something solid before pulling away. His eyes swept the room, landing on the emergency exit near the kitchen, and for just a moment, his expression shifted into something cold and calculating. Regina felt ice slide down her spine. She knew that look. She'd seen it before on the faces of men who'd made a decision they couldn't take back. And in that instant, standing in the middle of Chateau Marchand with a tray of empty glasses balanced on her palm, Regina John realized she was watching a man prepare to betray the person he was paid to protect. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was what she was going to do about it. Regina retreated behind the server station, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she forced herself to take slow, measured breaths. She needed to think. She needed to be rational. But rationality felt impossible when every instinct in her body was telling her to run, to clock out early, to pretend she hadn't seen anything. Men like Edward Williams lived in a world where witnesses didn't fare well. And she was just a waitress trying to keep her head above water. She was reaching for a stack of clean napkins when she saw Peter's hand move to the table. Not resting. Not still. Tapping. His index and middle fingers drummed against the white tablecloth in a rhythm that started slow, then accelerated, then stopped abruptly, then started again. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. A signal disguised as nervous energy. And someone, somewhere in this restaurant, was watching for it. Regina's eyes swept the dining room, trying to appear casual as she scanned faces. Most of the patrons were regulars, businessmen unwinding after long days, couples celebrating anniversaries, a few tourists taking pictures of their overpriced entrees. But near table 8, a man was moving. 30s maybe. Average height, average build, wearing the standard server uniform of black slacks and a white button-down. But his shoes were wrong. Too scuffed. And his collar sat crooked, as if the shirt had been borrowed in a hurry. Regina had never seen him before. He carried a gray plastic bin, the kind used for clearing tables, and moved toward the empty booth adjacent to Peter's position. His movements were smooth, unremarkable, the practiced efficiency of someone who'd worked in restaurants before. But Regina noticed the way his eyes locked onto Peter for half a second, the briefest acknowledgement, before he bent down to collect abandoned glassware. Peter's tapping stopped. The stranger set the bin on the edge of the table, using both hands to stack dirty plates. But his left hand slipped beneath a folded napkin, and when it emerged, something passed between them. A small package, no larger than a folded greeting card, wrapped in pale brown paper. It moved from the stranger's palm to Peter's hand in one fluid motion, so quick that anyone not watching closely would have missed it entirely. Regina's breath caught. The exchange was seamless, professional, rehearsed. Peter's hand closed around the package and disappeared into his jacket pocket in the same instant the stranger straightened and moved away, carrying his bin of dishes toward the kitchen as if nothing had happened. No words exchanged. No eye contact maintained. Just a transaction executed with the precision of two people who'd done this before. Regina's mind raced. The package was too thick to be just paper. She could tell by the way Peter's jacket pocket bulged slightly after he tucked it away. It wasn't an envelope. It wasn't a note. It was something heavier, something that carried weight both literally and figuratively. Cash, maybe. Or instructions. Or worse. Confirmation that whatever was about to happen had been approved and financed. Peter's hand pressed against his pocket once more, as if reassuring himself the package was still there. Then his eyes flicked toward the service corridor again, and this time, Regina saw him glance at his watch and nod, almost imperceptibly, to himself. He was on a timeline now. And so was Edward Williams, whether he knew it or not. Regina stood motionless behind the server station, her mind assembling the pieces with a clarity that felt almost violent. The package wasn't payment for a job completed. It was payment for a job about to happen. Peter had just received his final confirmation, the go-ahead from whoever was orchestrating this, and now he was waiting for the precise moment to execute whatever plan had been set in motion weeks or maybe months ago. Edward Williams wasn't just being betrayed. He was the product being sold. His life was the transaction Peter had just confirmed with that nod, with that glance at his watch, with that thick package now burning a hole in his jacket pocket. The realization hit her like a fist to the chest. She gripped the counter harder, her knuckles turning white. This wasn't about overhearing something she shouldn't. This wasn't about seeing a deal go down in a corner booth. This was about watching a man's murder unfold in real time, courses served between the setup and the kill. And she was the only person in this entire restaurant who knew. Her hands began to shake. She pressed them flat against the counter, trying to steady herself, but the trembling only worsened. Every fiber of her survival instinct screamed at her to walk away. Clock out. Go home. Forget she'd seen anything. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't brave. She was a waitress who couldn't afford to miss a shift, let alone get tangled up in whatever deadly web men like Edward Williams lived inside. But if she did nothing, she would watch him die. The thought lodged itself in her throat like a stone. She imagined it, Peter rising from his seat as Edward headed toward the exit, a subtle signal to accomplices waiting in the alley, the sound of gunfire muffled by distance and kitchen noise, and by the time anyone realized what had happened, Edward Williams would be a headline and she would be a witness who'd said nothing. She would have to live with that. Every morning. Every shift. Every time she saw her reflection. Regina's breathing quickened. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, the same advice she'd given since Regina was a child. Keep your head down, baby. The world isn't fair, and it doesn't reward people like us for being noble. Survive first. Everything else is a luxury. But something deeper stirred inside her, something that refused to be silenced by fear or pragmatism. She thought about her brother, about the promise she'd made to help him build a better life. What kind of life was she building if it required watching a murder and pretending she hadn't? Her hands were still shaking when she reached beneath the counter and pulled out the small notepad servers used for taking orders. She tore off a blank slip, her fingers clumsy, her pulse hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her skin. She had no plan. No strategy. No idea if this would work or if it would only get her killed alongside him. But she couldn't stand still anymore. She couldn't choose silence. Regina John picked up a pen, and for the first time in 4 years of working at Chateau Marchand, she stopped being invisible. Her first attempt was a disaster. The words came out frantic, illegible, a mess of scribbled panic that read like the ravings of someone losing their mind. Something wrong with Bodyguard, danger, please be careful, sprawled across the paper in uneven letters that would make Edward dismiss her as unstable or drunk. She crumpled it, her hands still shaking, and pulled another slip from the notepad. The second try was worse. Too vague. Watch out. Not safe. 5 words that communicated nothing useful, nothing actionable. He would read it and wonder if she meant the food, the wine, or if she was simply a paranoid server trying to insert herself into his evening. She tore it in half and dropped it into the trash bin beneath the counter. Focus, she told herself. You've watched him for weeks. You know how he thinks. You know he doesn't waste time on uncertainty. She pressed the pen to a fresh slip of paper and forced herself to breathe slowly. What would make him act? What would cut through his composure and trigger an immediate response? Not suspicion. Not fear. Certainty. He needed to know exactly what the threat was and where it was coming from. Her hand steadied as she wrote, each word deliberate and clear. Your bodyguard sold you out. You're the damn Ransom. She read it twice, her heart pounding. 8 words. No ambiguity. No room for misinterpretation. Peter wasn't just compromised. He was the architect of the betrayal. And Edward wasn't collateral damage. He was the prize. Regina folded the note with the same precision she used for napkins, creasing it into a tight rectangle small enough to tuck beneath the leather check presenter. Her hands moved on autopilot now, muscle memory taking over where courage faltered. She retrieved Edward's bill from the register, placed it inside the presenter, and slid the folded note underneath so only a corner peeked out, impossible to miss but invisible to anyone watching from a distance. The walk from the server station to table 12 felt like crossing a tightrope stretched over a canyon. Every step was a choice to keep going. Every breath was a decision not to turn back. She could feel Peter's eyes on her as she approached, could sense the weight of his suspicion even though his face remained neutral. Did he know? Could he tell she'd seen the exchange? Regina's survival instincts kicked in, the same ones that had kept her employed and alive in a world where powerful men held all the cards. She painted on her practiced smile, the one that was friendly without being familiar, attentive without being intrusive. She became, once again, the invisible server. Just another blur in the background of Edward Williams's evening. Here's your check, Mr. Williams, she said, her voice steady and professional, betraying nothing of the terror screaming inside her skull. She placed the leather presenter on the table beside his empty Scotch glass, her movements smooth and unhurried. Edward glanced up, his dark eyes meeting hers for half a second. Thank you. She nodded, stepped back and turned away, her heart hammering so violently she thought he might hear it. She forced herself to walk at a normal pace, not too fast, not too slow, back toward the server station where she could watch what happened next. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of leather sliding against tablecloth as Edward reached for the check. And Regina John realized she'd just crossed a line she could never uncross. Regina stood behind the server station, her hands gripping a wine glass she was pretending to polish, her eyes locked on table 12. The world had narrowed to a single point of focus. Edward Williams's right hand resting on the leather check presenter. Time stretched and warped, each second feeling like an hour, each breath burning in her lungs like she'd forgotten how to exhale. Edward lifted the presenter with the same unhurried grace he brought to everything, flipping it open to reveal the bill inside. His expression remained unchanged, calm, measured, the face of a man who'd spent a lifetime controlling every reaction, every tell. He glanced at the total, and for a moment, Regina thought he might miss the note entirely, might simply pull out his wallet and leave a stack of hundreds the way he always did. Then his fingers found the folded paper. The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent, though Regina knew the noise continued around her. The clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the soft jazz drifting from the sound system. But all of it faded into white noise as Edward unfolded the note with slow, deliberate movements. His eyes dropped to the words she'd written, and Regina stopped breathing. She watched his face for any reaction. Shock, anger, fear, disbelief. But Edward Williams gave her nothing. His expression didn't change. His posture didn't shift. He read the 8 words she'd risked everything to write, and his composure remained absolute, as if she'd simply informed him his steak was overcooked. But then his eyes lifted. They found her across the dining room, cutting through the distance between them with surgical precision. Regina felt her stomach drop. His gaze held hers for no more than 2 seconds, maybe less, but in that brief exchange, she understood that he knew. He knew she'd written the note. He knew she'd seen something. And most terrifying of all, he believed her. There was no gratitude in his eyes. No warmth. Just a cold, unsettling acknowledgement that said more than words ever could. He folded the note back into a tight square and slipped it into his jacket pocket beside his wallet. Then, without any visible urgency, he lifted his hand and gestured for her attention. Regina's legs felt like water as she approached the table. "I'll take care of this now," Edward said, his voice low and even, pulling several bills from his wallet and placing them inside the presenter. His movements were casual, unhurried, a man simply settling his tab. But Regina noticed the way his other hand had moved to rest on the table's edge. His body already shifted slightly forward, preparing to rise. "Thank you for your service tonight," he added, his eyes meeting hers once more. The words were ordinary, meaningless on the surface. But Regina heard what he wasn't saying, the acknowledgement, the warning, the promise that whatever happened next would change both their lives. Edward stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. "I'll be heading out," he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by Peter, who immediately rose from his chair, falling into position 3 steps behind. But Edward didn't move toward the main entrance where Peter expected him to go. He turned left, toward the hallway that led to the restrooms and, beyond that, the kitchen service corridor. And Regina watched as Peter's entire body went rigid, his hand already moving toward his jacket. Edward moved through the dining room with the same measured pace he always maintained, passing tables of diners who didn't look up from their meals, unaware they were witnessing something far more dangerous than a man heading to the restroom. Peter followed, his footsteps heavier now, less controlled. Regina could see the tension radiating from him, the way his right hand hovered near his chest, ready to reach inside his jacket at a moment's notice. They passed the restroom entrance. Edward didn't slow. He continued straight into the narrow hallway that led to the kitchen, a corridor most patrons never saw, lined with storage closets and utility panels. Regina's heart seized. This was it. Whatever Peter had planned, whatever ambush waited in the alley behind the restaurant, Edward was walking directly into the kill zone. But then Edward stopped. His hand shot out, pressing flat against the wall panel beside the industrial refrigerator. Regina had walked past that panel 1,000 times, had assumed it was just part of the wall structure. But when Edward pushed, it gave way with a soft click, revealing a narrow passage she'd never known existed. A utility shaft that dropped down to the basement loading dock where deliveries were received before the restaurant opened. In the same instant, a figure emerged from the kitchen shadows. Not a chef. Not a server. A man in a dark suit, compact and silent, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for a specific signal. Edward's hand moved in a subtle gesture, 2 fingers extended, and the man nodded once before positioning himself at the hallway entrance, blocking Peter's approach. Edward dropped through the hatch. The sound of his descent, feet hitting metal rungs, the whisper of fabric against steel, was barely audible over the kitchen noise. But Peter heard it. And in that moment, every ounce of his carefully maintained composure shattered like glass. "No!" The word exploded from him, raw and desperate, echoing through the hallway with enough force that several diners turned their heads. Peter's hand plunged inside his jacket, emerging with a compact black pistol that caught the overhead light as he raised it toward the man blocking his path. The dining room erupted into chaos. A woman screamed. Chairs scraped against hardwood as patrons dove beneath tables or scrambled toward the exits. Regina pressed herself against the server station, her entire body locked in terror as she watched Peter's face transform into something feral, all pretense of loyalty stripped away. "Move!" Peter shouted at the man guarding the hatch, but the figure didn't budge. His own hand had moved inside his jacket, though he didn't draw, his stance wide and immovable. Peter's weapon swung wildly between the guard and the open hatch, his breathing ragged, his eyes wide with the panic of a plan collapsing in real time. He lunged forward, trying to force his way past, but the guard shifted, blocking him again. Somewhere in the kitchen, Regina heard the clatter of pans hitting the floor, staff scrambling away from the confrontation. "He's gone, Peter," the guard said quietly, his voice calm despite the weapon pointed at his chest. "It's over." Peter's jaw clenched, his finger trembling on the trigger. For a terrible moment, Regina thought he might fire anyway, might kill the guard just to vent his rage. But then his eyes flicked toward the dining room, toward the dozens of witnesses now staring at him, phones raised and recording, and the full weight of his failure crashed down on him. His cover was blown. His treason was confirmed. And Edward Williams had vanished into a route Peter never knew existed, warned by a waitress who'd seen too much. The standoff lasted less than 30 seconds before Peter made his choice. He lowered the weapon, his face twisted with rage and something darker, the cold calculation of a man already planning his next move. Without a word, he turned and bolted toward the main entrance, shoving past terrified diners who pressed themselves against walls to let him pass. The guard didn't pursue. He simply stood watch over the hatch until Peter disappeared through the front doors, then spoke quietly into a phone Regina couldn't see. The police arrived 6 minutes later. By then, the manager had herded most of the patrons into the bar area, offering complimentary drinks and profuse apologies while staff gave statements to officers who seemed unsurprised by the violence, as if they'd expected a call from Chateau Marchand eventually. Regina told them what everyone else had seen. A bodyguard pulled a gun, shouted, and fled. She didn't mention the note. She didn't mention the exchange with the fake server. And when the officer asked if she knew why the bodyguard had reacted that way, she shook her head and said she had no idea. But as she stood near the server station, giving her statement, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The man who'd exchanged the package with Peter, the one in the wrong shoes with the crooked collar, was standing near the bar, watching her. His face was calm, almost bored, but his eyes never left her. And when Regina met his gaze, he didn't look away. He simply tilted his head slightly, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. But Regina understood. He'd seen her deliver the check. He'd seen Edward read something. And now Edward was gone and Peter's plan had collapsed, and this man was connecting the pieces in real time. She was compromised. The manager insisted she finish her shift. "We need all hands with this mess." And Regina moved through the remaining hours like a ghost, delivering drinks and clearing tables while her mind screamed at her to run. But where? And to what? If these people wanted to find her, they would. They knew where she worked. They could find out where she lived. When her shift finally ended at midnight, Regina changed out of her uniform in the staff bathroom, hands shaking so badly she could barely button her coat. She left through the front entrance, keeping her head down, and walked toward the subway station 3 blocks away. The November air bit through her jacket, but she barely felt it. Every sound made her flinch. Every shadow seemed to move. 2 blocks from the restaurant, she checked her reflection in a storefront window and saw him. The man from the bar, walking 30 feet behind her, his pace matching hers exactly. When she sped up, he sped up. When she slowed, pretending to check her phone, he slowed too. Regina's heart hammered. She'd grown up in neighborhoods where you learn to spot predators, and every instinct told her this man wasn't just walking in the same direction. He was hunting. She bypassed the subway entrance and turned sharply down a side street, breaking into a run. Her apartment was 4 blocks away, an old walk-up in a building with a temperamental security door. She heard footsteps behind her, heavy and fast, no longer bothering with pretense. She ran harder, her breath burning in her lungs, and burst through the building's entrance, slamming the door behind her and punching in the code with trembling fingers. The lock clicked. She stumbled up 3 flights of stairs, fumbled with her keys, and threw herself inside her apartment, deadbolting the door and pressing her back against it as her legs finally gave out. Through the peephole, she watched the stairwell. Empty. But she knew he was out there. Knew they were deciding what to do with her. Regina John slid to the floor, her phone clutched in her hand, and understood with perfect clarity that saving Edward Williams's life had just made her a target. She didn't sleep. She sat on her apartment floor with her back pressed against the door, watching the deadbolt as if it might turn on its own, listening to every creak in the hallway, every distant siren, every footstep from the apartment above. Her phone sat in her lap, fully charged, though she didn't know who she would call. The police? And tell them what? That she'd interfered with a Mafia assassination and now the conspirators knew her face? Her mother. The thought crossed her mind a dozen times, but each time she pushed it away. Calling home would only drag her family into this darkness, And Regina had spent 4 years keeping them separate from the world she navigated to survive. She wouldn't poison that distance now. The call came at 3:47 in the morning. Regina's phone vibrated against her thigh, the screen lighting up with a number she didn't recognize. No name. No location. Just 10 digits glowing in the darkness. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but something stopped her. The certainty that whoever was calling already knew she was awake, already knew she was sitting on her floor, terrified and alone. She answered without speaking. Regina John. The voice on the other end was female, smooth and controlled, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to command attention. Not cold, but clinical, the tone of someone accustomed to delivering information that couldn't be questioned. You don't know me, but I know you. And more importantly, Mr. Williams knows you. Regina's throat closed. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. Your note saved his life tonight, the woman continued, as if she were discussing the weather. 8 words. Precise. Accurate. You identified the threat, the source, and the stakes. That kind of observation doesn't come from luck, Regina. It comes from skill. And now that skill has made you visible. I didn't, Regina's voice cracked. I didn't want any of this. No one ever does. There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling in the background. But intent doesn't matter now. Peter's network knows you intervened. They saw you deliver that check. They watched Edward escape. And they will come for you, not because they want to, but because leaving you alive makes them look weak. Regina's hands shook so violently she almost dropped the phone. What do you want from me? Mr. Williams wants to thank you personally, the woman said, her tone shifting slightly, becoming almost conversational. But more than that, he wants to ensure you survive what comes next. Peter's betrayal runs deeper than one bodyguard. There are others involved, people we need to identify. And you, Regina, have proven you see things others miss. I'm just a waitress. You were a waitress. The correction was gentle but absolute. As of tonight, your life of anonymity is over. You stepped into our world the moment you wrote that note. Now you have 2 choices. Step in further and let us protect you, or stay in your apartment and wait for Peter's people to finish what they started. Regina closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She thought about her brother, about her mother, about the quiet life she'd fought so hard to maintain. All of it felt impossibly far away now, like a dream she could barely remember. What do I have to do? She whispered. Be ready, the woman said. A car will arrive at your building in 20 minutes. You'll be taken somewhere safe, and we'll discuss what you saw tonight. Every detail, every face, every movement. Mr. Williams needs to understand how deep Peter's treason goes. And after that, we'll decide what role you play moving forward. And if I say no? The silence stretched for several seconds before the woman spoke again, her voice softer now, almost sympathetic. Then we'll do our best to protect you from a distance. But Regina, you need to understand, these people don't leave loose ends. And right now, you're the loosest end they have. The line went dead. Regina sat in the darkness, phone still pressed to her ear, and realized she'd already made her choice the moment she wrote that note. There was no going back to invisibility. No returning to the safety of being overlooked. She stood on shaking legs, walked to her bedroom, and began packing a bag. 20 minutes later, she was standing on the sidewalk when a black sedan pulled up to the curb, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever waited inside. The back door opened. Regina John took a breath and stepped into the shadows. The training began the next morning. Not in some underground facility or remote compound, but in a renovated warehouse in an industrial district Regina had never noticed despite living in the city her entire life. The woman from the phone call was waiting. Olivia, she introduced herself, offering no last name, and beside her stood Marcus, a man built like a wall with eyes that missed nothing. You survived on observation, Olivia said, walking slow circles around Regina. Now you'll learn to weaponize it. The first week was brutal. Regina was pushed through physical conditioning that left her gasping, her muscles screaming. She ran obstacle courses designed to test reflexes, endured combat drills that taught her how to move when cornered, learned to read body language not just for tips but for survival. Every failure was met with quiet correction, never cruelty, but absolute expectation that she would rise and try again. Marcus barely spoke, but when he did, his words carved themselves into her memory. You already know how to disappear. Now learn when to be seen. By the third week, something shifted inside her. The terror that had gripped her throat since that night at Chateau Marchand began to transform into something sharper, colder. She stopped flinching at sudden movements. Her hands steadied when handling weapons during training. Her eyes learned to track multiple threats simultaneously, cataloging exits and analyzing intentions before words were spoken. She met Edward Williams only once during this period. He arrived without warning, observing her from the shadows of the training floor as she completed a surveillance exercise. When she finished, he stepped forward, his expression unreadable. You saved my life, he said quietly, because you saw what others missed. That kind of sight is rare. Don't waste it by being afraid of what you've become. He left without waiting for a response, but his words lingered. Regina spent the next 2 months being immersed in Edward's world, attending quiet gatherings where power was exchanged in whispers, learning to decode the silent language of alliances and betrayals, understanding that every conversation carried layers most people never heard. She was introduced as an associate, her past as a waitress never mentioned, as if that version of herself had been erased entirely. And in many ways it had. The woman who once worried about rent and counted tips no longer existed. In her place stood someone who could read a room the way others read books, who understood that survival in this world required not just observation but the courage to act on what was seen. 6 months after that night at Chateau Marchand, Regina stood on the rooftop of a building overlooking the city, the cold wind biting through her coat. Below, the streets pulsed with life. People rushing to jobs, to homes, to lives they believed were their own. She had once been one of them, invisible and desperate, moving through a world that never saw her. But she had made a choice. Written 8 words on a slip of paper. And everything changed. She touched the small silver pendant around her neck, a gift from Olivia, a symbol that she now belonged to something larger than herself. It felt heavy against her skin, not with weight but with meaning. Regina understood now that some people spend their entire lives waiting to be noticed, hoping someone would see their value. But the truth was harder and simpler. You became visible the moment you decided to act, the moment you stopped hiding and claimed the space you occupied. Her phone buzzed. A message from Olivia. New assignment. Downtown. 1 hour. Regina pocketed the phone and turned from the edge, her reflection catching in the glass door behind her. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Poised, alert, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weapons and everything to do with will. She had been Regina John, the invisible waitress. Now she was something else entirely. And there was no going back. Maybe all of us have been Regina at some point. Living quietly, moving through our days unseen, wondering if we matter. But the real question isn't whether opportunity will come. It's whether we'll be brave enough to seize it when it does. Even when the cost is everything familiar. Even when there's no promise of safety on the other side. Regina's story isn't just about survival in a dangerous world. It's about the moment we stop being who others expect us to be and become who we choose to become. It's about understanding that invisibility is sometimes a choice we make out of fear, and visibility requires courage we didn't know we had. What about you? Have you ever stood at a threshold the way Regina did? Have you faced a choice between staying safe and stepping into something that terrified you but promised transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd be honored to hear what resonated with you. Every story reflects a piece of life, and through your voice, we might find the connection that our busy days often steal from us. If this story touched something inside you, please remember to like the video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we bring to you. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. We wish you strength, courage, and the wisdom to know when to step out of the shadows and into your own light. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.